equal work, marry who you love, environment, all the things that, ring true for me and ring true for my wife. And those of you, if you get to know me a little bit, I'm not shy and pretty outspoken. My wife is as well. And but we left that dinner and got in the car, and it was dead silence. We only lived 10 minutes away, but we didn't say anything. And as we approached the house, and there's still debate as to who said what, but it was a wow. That was amazing. And that's the kind of person who should be president of the United States. And if he ever decides to run for president, we're in. We're in. And we let it be known to our friends in Chicago that if he ever runs for president, we'd like to help him. And sure enough, it was later that year that he decided to run for president. So this was February 2006, was the dinner. Later that year, he makes the decision to run, makes the official announcement February of the following year in 2007. And we began a process. We were with him. There were less people than there are in this room here today. We were with him that evening, the day he announced. He announced in Springfield, Springfield, Illinois, and flew up to Chicago. And we were there in an apartment with him where he was introduced as the next president of the United States. Little pinch yourself moment. I'll tell you, fast forward. We were working every day. We were on his National Finance Committee. We were completely engaged. We decided to have our first big event. This was his first big event, first with Secret Service. It was June of that year. You see time's moving along. And Michelle and Barack at the time, now the president and the first lady, which he wasn't then, were coming over to the house, and we had a collection of our friends there. And I had a phone call just before they were coming. And they said, we need to bring somebody else. Can we have your permission? And I said, who would that be? And they said, Annie Leibovitz. And I said, Annie Leibovitz is coming to my house? The photographer, world famous, etc. And of course, so she comes, and this is before everybody's doing selfies, so people were taking their cameras, and she was clicking the picture. So they had a picture by Annie, of Annie with them. So virtual selfies with Annie. Of course, I didn't do it because I thought, I'm above that. I'm here with the potential president. Now I regret that. But everybody's running over to Annie Leibovitz, and I'm going, hey, we got Barack Obama over here. But it was the beginning of a journey, and I had the distinct pleasure of going to his first debates in New Hampshire and Iowa, and traveling with him. My wife traveled with him to Mississippi, at Ole Miss, Los Angeles, where he debated Hillary, Ole Miss, where he ended up debating John McCain. And we were very much involved in the campaign. Campaign was over, we went back to work, went back to our lives. Sure enough, a few years go by, and we get a phone call. Another opportunity. Group of people said, we're looking to open the headquarters for the Obama headquarters back in Chicago, and can we stay in your house? 2 or 3 people, sure. We have plenty of bedrooms, our kids are all grown and off. So they stayed in the house. Before they left, my wife was the co-chair of the state of Illinois for the re-elect of the president. I was on the path to becoming the co-chair of the National Business Advisory Committee to the re-election of the president. And then through the end of that campaign, you go to so many of these meetings and you hear the First Lady and you hear the President, and he sits in front of a room like this and says, what are you going to do to give back to your country? And those of you who've done well financially, what are you going to do good? And so what are you going to do to get back? And that was ingrained in our head as we attended so many sessions with the President and the First Lady over a lot of years. And so when given the opportunity to represent the United States, it was an easy decision at that point. So that led up to it. It wasn't just one day out of the blue, here's the phone call, would you like to be ambassador? We developed a strong relationship, not only with the family, but the core leadership of the campaign and some number of people within the White House. And so that was an easy set of decisions. Then the decision was where. And that was also an easy decision. And we said Canada, Canada, Canada. Why Canada? Well, it's the connections that we had in our family, both personally and professionally. And my wife's family originally immigrated to Canada, and her great-grandparents and grandfather were from Canada. I had business here and did business, and we vacationed here. My first international trip was right here to Montreal to Expo 67. And I had the wonderful experience this last year of going back to the site, which for the first time since I got lost as a kid, and my parents were panicked when I was lost running around Expo 67. So Montreal holds a place dear to me, but also our family is very well connected to Canada. So it was an easy decision for us. This last year marks 2 years we're here. We've traveled every province and every territory. We have now repeated most provinces, and I'm about to go to all the territories again, as I'm going to go on a northern tour in the Arctic this spring. Amazing country, unbelievable. Had the opportunity to interact with business leaders, community leaders, philanthropists, artists. As much as you think this country is powerful, diverse, and has so much potential, you have no idea unless you get out and have the opportunity to travel and see it. And we have been embraced with such enthusiasm and warmth throughout the country, and deeply appreciative of that. When I arrived, I had 4 distinct objectives for the mission Canada for the United States. As the most senior U.S. government official in Canada, that means everybody who works for the executive branch in Canada is under my authority. Now, I don't have they don't call me up and, reporting line. It works in some ways like government structure, but like a corporate structure as well. We have 7 consulates, one here, and Nina is our consul general here in Montreal, but we have 7 consul generals across the country. We have 8 airports where you can fortunately go into the airport and get right into the United States by clearing. We call that pre-clearance, and you have it here in Montreal. You have it 7 other locations across the country. Those people standing there, those U.S. border officials, are also under U.S. government authority, Chief of Mission Authority. So I had 4 primary objectives across the country. First was to enhance our economic opportunity cross-border trade. Second, the focus on energy with a big word, and the environment. And I think that there was at least some perspective. It was you either worked on the environment or you worked on energy, but it was an or. And I thought the word or was the wrong word, and the big word is and. Third, we're doing a lot on cultural exchanges and cultural diplomacy. I can touch on that if we have time. Fourth, multilateral things. What do we do together around the world? What do we do in NATO? What do we do in dealing with crises? Everything from Ebola to newly developed issues like Zika. What are we doing with NORAD in protecting North America? What do we do together? And so those are multilateral issues typically. And the last one, which was not on my list when I first arrived, and frankly I took it a little more for granted until I traveled the country, and I asked everybody, what's the single most important to you as a Canadian about the U.S.? And there was one answer that kept surfacing over and over and over, and that was the border. The border had to function well. Whether you were in business and you wanted to sell products, the border had to function well. Whether you're a tourist and you were just going over, the border had to function well. Whether you had family members that you went to visit or you went to school cross-border, the border had to function well. And so a term that I've become very acquainted with of thin or thick border, how easy the border functions. I'm fighting for thin border and working well. But we also have the balance of national security issues and protecting people on both sides of our border. So it has to be appropriately thin for free trade and travel and tourism, and appropriately thick for anything that could potentially do harm. And there are all kinds of things that I never was aware of. 400,000 people cross the border every day, on average. That doesn't even take into account big sporting events or different things. So you can just imagine 400,000 people across the border. There are issues that happen when 400,000 people do anything. And even if it's 4 people or 6 people, sure enough, that ends up being the headlines in the news, and it ends up making a perception of what the borders are like. I'm here to tell you the border works really well. We cross millions and millions and millions of people across the border every week, every month, every year, and it works incredibly well. There are times where we have some bumps in the road, but it's few and far between. I love what I do. I love this opportunity, but I'm going to love even more sitting down with the students and getting a perspective. And so very much this is going to be about getting a perspective from representatives of your community, some questions that were submitted by some of you in the room, but I thought we'd get together and start diving in if you guys are ready to do that. I can see the moderators are sitting over here. This is nice. Omar and Callie, thanks for leading this session. I'm very appreciative of that. Very appreciative of the interns back in the consulate who are working hard. Where are they hiding? I know they're hiding somewhere. There they are. Thank you. And Jessica, happy birthday. I heard it was your birthday today. All right, are we ready to get going? And how do we want to do this? Am I taking this mic with me? That's what I'm doing, right? Yeah, okay, I can do this. Believe it or not, I did make some notes here.
So thank you, Ambassador, for your lovely speech. We thought before we start with our kind of discussing how we're going to conduct the rest of the event, we would first introduce our student panelists. First we have Marta. Marta is a 4th-year student studying political science and history. On campus, she is involved with the Model United Nations community and IRSM, where she recently served on the board of directors as Secretary General of the McGill Model United Nations Assembly. Off campus, she has interned with the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City and has worked with the NATO Council of Canada as a junior research fellow.
Okay, and then so Simon studies economics, political science, and finance at McGill University with a special interest in monetary policy, macroeconomic theory, and international diplomacy. He is a research assistant for Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, was a member of McGill's winning team of the Bank of Canada Monetary Policy Competition, and competed on the McGill Prima International Risk Management Case competition that won against 116 other teams. He will be studying at LSE next year in the MSc of Economics.
Erica is from Boston, Massachusetts, and majors in economic and political science. She is the editor-in-chief of the McGill Journal of Political Studies and is involved in leading female empowerment initiatives both on campus and in the Montreal community.
Kareem Ibrahim is a U3 student in international development who currently serves as the president of the Student Society of McGill University. His interests include human rights, environmental sustainability, and international relations.
Molly Harris is a 2nd-year student at McGill, majoring in North American Studies and minoring in history. She is president of the North American Studies Students Association, a fellow of the Canadian Jewish Political Affairs Committee, and the vice president of external relations of McGill students for Save a Child's Heart.
Steve is a 2nd-year student pursuing a dual degree in political science and psychology. On campus, he serves as the Vice President of Internal Operations for the International Relations Student Association, where he was a delegate representing their NGO to the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, and competes on their Model UN team, as well as being the Sergeant at Arms for Delta Kappa Epsilon. Hailing from a small town in New Hampshire, Steve hopes to join the U.S. Foreign Service.
All right, so as we introduce our panelists, we'll explain further how the next 45 minutes will be conducted. So Ambassador Heyman has some grilling questions he is ready to ask our panelists, who will then conduct a back and forth discussion about these topics that the Ambassador will address. So Ambassador, you have the floor.
So why don't we start with just a top level, 40,000 foot, how do you see U.S.-Canada relations from your perspective? What trends do you see? What things do you think that Well, let's just leave it at that, and then we can talk about what you think I should be working on, but let's leave it at that for a minute.
Marta, Steve, Molly, would you like to answer?
So I see the United States-Canada relationship mainly in two different facilities. One being their economic relationship, and the second being their global international security relationship. As JFK once said, geography made us neighbors, history made us friends, economics made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature hath so joined together, let no man put asunder. And I think that definitely characterizes the relationship that we have. Because we're so close together, it's very important that the United States and Canada trade as much as they do. For example, the trade across the Ambassador Bridge alone between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, Michigan is equal to all of the trade between the United States and Japan in total. So we need to make sure that we are not only continuing all of the economic trade that we have between the two countries, all of the foreign direct investment and market sharing, but even improving upon the trade that we have right now. For example, almost 100% of Canada's energy exports go to the United States. They are 25% of the United States oil imports. And to improve that relationship would allow the United States to divest itself from a lot more harmful relationships that they have in the Middle East with oil exporting countries. And so continuing to foster the economic relationship that the United States and Canada have is going to be not only extremely important to building the GDP of both countries, but making sure that they have a very important trading partner on the border. And the other piece there is going to be security. I think the United States needs to make sure that they have a full-throated support of Canada's bid for a seat at the United Nations. And I think that they need to make sure that going forward, they try and correlate all of their security efforts so they have more of a united front. A lot of the time, especially recently, a lot of the engagements that the United States have had abroad hasn't necessarily been backed by Canada. And by having that security relationship and showing that we have a coalition of Western forces, I think is going to look a lot better on the international scene.
So wait a minute, before you hand that mic over.
Sure.
How are we doing?
I think we're doing.
I mean, you know, how's it going right now?
If I had to give it a letter grade in comparison to all of our other relationships, which I think is really the only way you can grade it, I think it's an A. But I think there's a lot more room for improvement, and there's ways to separate that relationship from all the other ones that we have, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so while I think there have been some ups and downs in the Canada-U.S. relationship historically, I think that it has generally been a really good one on issues like defense and cross-border trade and the movement of people between the two countries. The U.S. and Canada have been very good allies. When there's a crisis in the world or in either of the two countries, I think that Canada and the U.S. have always been a great team responder. I think in terms of the relationship, at least from the Canadian perspective, there have been a few small issues or irritants, and I guess I'm more aware of the Canadian ones, so I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on the American ones. But in terms of issues like softwood lumber trade or the Keystone XL pipeline, I think that kind of highlights some of them. I think what you said about cultural exchanges is very interesting. I think in the past 20, 30, 40 years, there have been a lot of efforts to promote particularly Canadian culture throughout North America, and I think that that is somewhere where the relationship is going.
Hey, so yeah, I think Steve and Molly have made some great points, and yeah, I totally agree that the relationship between U.S. and Canada is the most important one we have. It has been said that the role of the Prime Minister in Canada is to unify the country, grow the economy, and manage our relations with the United States. And I think that's true. In terms of general trends, to be quite candid, I do think we're coming out of a rut in Canada-U.S. relations. Under Prime Minister Harper had a lot of specific goals he wanted to achieve, and I believe that he reduced the Canada-U.S. relationship to some very specific issues, the obvious one being Keystone XL. And I think coming out of that, we've already seen so much headway being done with Prime Minister Trudeau attending the first state dinner in 20 years, and I think that's very promising. As for what's coming up in the future, I'm most interested in two particular issues. One of them being our engagement with multilateral fora. Prime Minister Trudeau has been very explicit in his desire to re-engage with things like the United Nations, and I think that can be done in partnership with with the American administration. President Obama has talked about how he really wants to re-engage and revitalize peacekeeping, and Canada has a long legacy in UN peacekeeping, and I think that this can be done in a partnership. The second one, and I think Steve brought this up, is the topic of security and the coalition of forces that we have going on in the Middle East. And I think cooperation on that front needs to emphasize and understand that we're two very different nations. We work together, but we come from very different capacities. So I think Prime Minister Trudeau has been very candid with President Obama about our capacities and the nature of the response we want to have in the Middle East, and I think that we can continue working together on that front.
So when you talk about capacity, are you talking about will versus skill? I mean, how do you think about that in terms of the capacity is, from your perspective, a Canadian desire to position itself differently, or is it the resources are not as large as the United States, so we have to participate at a different level?
So I'm a committed multilateralist, so I'm coming from that perspective. But I think I agree very much with something that Prime Minister Trudeau has continually emphasized, which is that our role in the Middle East should not be a combat one. We have a long history, an almost 50, 60-year history of being a very liberal internationalist power, and we engage with multilateral fora, we engage by diplomacy and things like that. I think that in terms of our response in the Middle East, we have more to offer than a combat role. So what we've been doing is, for example, focusing a lot on training local forces, and many American politicians agree that that is exactly where we need to be focusing. So I think that's one area where we can bring our strength and our experience, for example, with peacekeeping, much better than in a combat role, if that makes sense.
So just give you some perspective. First of all, the administration and this ambassador totally agrees that Canada has a lot to offer in a lot of different areas, and I think that we together have found a great balance, and the U.S. is very pleased with the Canadian contribution to the coalition. And we've expressed that at multiple levels, and feel very happy because there are gaps within all the different efforts that you commit around the world, and Canada can actually be, fill some critical gaps given the skill set, and you expressed that fairly well. I would say that President Obama is also a multilateralist, and you think about the way we are trying to tackle the various things that are presented to us from around the world. So from a free trade accord, it's not bilateral or trilateral, it's multilateral, it's 12 nations. Working with NATO, multilateral. Working in the coalition to combat Daesh, more than 65 countries bringing together to deal with that. The coalition on climate change, where 200 nations came together. The president was personally, directly involved in soliciting many leaders around the world to come together in Paris and be a part of that. Whether it's tackling disease, Ebola, and I mentioned like Zika is picking up. We're all working together, and so we're more similarly aligned right this minute, and a lot of good things are happening right now. One point, Steve, just so you know, just for the math's sake, and your presentation was great. The United States right now is importing 3.4 million barrels a day from Canada. That represents 43% of our imported oil. 43% of our imported oil. So it looks more, and I'll do the math quickly in my head, it's probably closer to that 20-25% of our total oil needs, but not of our imported oil. We found a lot ourselves, and we've grown much more self-sufficient. And as we reduce purchases around the world, we actually have been increasing purchases from Canada. So Canada is getting closer to half of our external needs. And by the way, we buy hydro, natural gas, solar, we buy wind, we buy energy, of all sorts from Canada. Huge resource-rich nation and a great partner. Why don't we stay in the environment for a minute and just talk a little bit about, will you just give me a sense of, both leaders of both countries have taken environment and made it an incredibly important issue, a priority. And is that a priority for you? Is that a priority for your peer groups? Do we have this right? Do you understand the passion that we're all putting into this and why we really think that this is important? And how are we doing on that? How are we doing in that regard? I mean, how well are we? And I say we, I say the United States and Canada, but how do you think we're doing?
Okay, so Erica and Simon will be answering this question.
Sure.
Okay, so first off, I do think it is very important, and I think if I talk to my peers, very few of them actually go against it. It's mostly in the media that I will see opposition. And I usually hear three main arguments against it. The first is that global warming doesn't exist, which just doesn't seem like a great argument. 99% of the scientific community has basically acknowledged it, so I won't really talk about that. The second argument is that liberal governments are using it to enlarge their government, the size of government. And I also think that's a weak argument. I think we shouldn't be judging policies by their motivation. I think we should judge them by what they're doing. The potato chip was invented by accident. No, but I joke. I do actually think we should be judging them. And the third argument against global warming, and I think this is the one that should be taken most seriously, is that we can't actually do too much about it. And to that, I'm going to point to, I'm very proud to be working for Ecofiscal, which is a commission that is, as you mentioned earlier, we're proposing policies that bridge environmental and economic interests at the same time. And on our advisory board, we have the head of McKinsey Global, Dominic Barton. We have the former Prime Minister, Paul Martin. We even have the CEO of Suncor, Steve Williams. And all of these people agree that these environmental policies exist, that they work, and that they're the way forward for Canada. And so I do think, basically our challenge right now is to get people on board with climate change, that it's happening, that we can do something about it. And so that's the role of government. I think there's also a role from the private sector. And we've seen companies, Tesla just launched the Model 3, which is a mass market electric car. Uber and Airbnb have these rideshare programs and room share programs. And this is a lot of headway in terms of the global warming front. I think there's still a lot more to be done, and I think we can do it.
So how are we doing?
I think there are still a lot of skeptics, and as I mentioned, I don't think their arguments are great, so I think we need to convince them, but we're on the right track.
We're on the right track, okay.
So Simon touched on a lot of very good points, and I think that he summarized our age group's opinions relatively well. I don't have a lot of friends who, actually I can't name a single person I know who is a climate change quote-unquote denier. It's really more along the lines of different opinions on how it should be addressed or at what level it should be addressed, as you said. I agree. There's absolutely a massive role for the private sector, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge that historically government grants have also been an extremely important driver of innovation in science, technology, energy. They fund research at universities, research organizations, private sector companies. This is really important because a lot of projects that involve climate change don't offer immediate financial gain, or they don't offer financial gain at all. So they wouldn't really survive without government assistance. Moreover, a lot of research into renewable energy is also being conducted by small firms and startups, which also have very limited options to funding research, development, and commercialization activities. So while there is room for the private sector, I think that the government should do a very close job of making sure that money is allotted to to climate research. And I know that it is right now, but it also tends to be an area that gets cut as soon as budgets become tight. I personally think that more priority should be placed on it. I do think that we've made excellent strides. COP21 is fantastic. The fact that we're signing it in a couple days is even better. And the fact that the US and Canada have been together on this the entire way is fantastic. I don't know, I think I'd probably give us a B+ on that policy. For all the reasons Simon mentioned, and I think that there's always more we can do, and this is an area that the U.S. really can, push forward and be a leader, a global leader, because we have the resources in Canada as well. So.
I think Canada's done an amazing job, especially with this brand new government in a very short window. Minister McKenna was given this portfolio, and she had to, in just a few weeks, get to Paris. And the Prime Minister brought the premiers around the country, about business leaders and community leaders and scientists, and had a very large delegation that he took with him to Paris, which made an incredible statement on a global stage of the role of Canada in dealing with climate change. And I think that was a first step, but that was just a few weeks into his administration. And then obviously with the state dinner, we came out with a whole group of working statements on being very much aligned with the United States in the efforts that we're doing. But now I think we're entering, and we're beginning to enter post, let's call it this next week, when the Prime Minister and the President signed this agreement. We find ourselves at a point of now the hard stuff has to happen. Now we have to implement things to make sure that we reach the goals of not exceeding the two degrees of climate temperature change. And this is not easy. This is going to be hard. It's going to be a hard lift for the U.S. It's going to be hard for Canada, but that doesn't mean it's not going to get done. In fact, I am confident it will get done, but it's not going to be without some challenges. So I'll accept the B+, knowing that we have work to do now on both sides of the border and together on implementation. But we reached a methane agreement, which methane in and of itself, it contributes 25 times more to carbon than other fuels. And so this is an easy thing to start tackling. Not easy to do, but easy to grab onto and implement. I will tell you 3 things hit the news last week that told me they were kind of ahas. You mentioned one of them, the Tesla 3. Tesla 3 has now close to 300,000, around 300,000 orders for this car, all right? 300,000 orders. The largest selling car in the United States on an annual basis sells about 300,000 cars. And so what happened was that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the numbers are pretty close, that when Elon Musk did a survey and said if you got 70 miles to the charge on the car, how many people would be interested in the car? It was about 7%. But if you had 200 miles to the charge, it was 70% of the people would be interested in potentially getting the car. And because the fear of how far can I drive and what can I do with it. So that was number one. Number two, there was an article in the paper that the Mexican government was ordering millions of cars off the road in Mexico City because of the severe pollution that was taking place. Now, we had seen warnings like this in Beijing, we'd seen it in India, we've seen it now in Mexico. There's an aha kind of moment that cars are actually polluting the air, and people are seeing the practical aspects of that. Number three, which, I have no more detail other than what I read in the paper, but the Saudi government was considering investing $2 trillion to diversify outside of the oil industry. And so you sit down and go, wow, they're going to invest outside of the oil industry. And so you see a series of these things. And I think bringing it all together, I think we're at that point where adoption is going to be maybe easier than it's been in a long time. The Prime Minister made great headlines around the world, and I think fabulous demonstration when he announced that half of his cabinet would be female and half male. And of course, the infamous quote, because it's 2015. So how do you think we're doing? And I say we, I keep saying US, Canada, but you can say US side or Canadian side. How are we doing more broadly in government, at leadership levels, around our two countries in terms of representation, and maybe not just women and men, but maybe LGBTQ issues, maybe other racial issues of black and white and Hispanic and people of color. How are we doing? And then, do you have a perspective of U.S. versus Canada in this?
So, Erica and Kareem, please. You would be asking a question.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something I think about often. I just was looking online recently, and a study was conducted, and Canada rates 50th in the world in terms of gender parity in government officials, and the U.S. ranks 95th. So I guess, yeah, to answer your question, we're probably not doing that great. We are, as you said earlier, the largest economic power in the world. The U.S. is, Canada among that as well. And we can be frank about the fact that I think economic access leads to better education, and we have among the best educated people in our countries. But that is certainly not reflected in the representation of our politicians. So I definitely think that's somewhere we can improve.
So, but why do you think that is? I mean, 95th is awful, right? You know, I'm a competitive guy. 95th anything doesn't sound very good, and it's not. 50th is better, a lot better, but still not really great.
Yeah.
Why is that? And is it the demand side or is it the supply side? Meaning, are people not raising their hands to get into politics because of politics itself and saying this is not something I want to participate in?
Yeah.
Or, is it that people are not choosing people that are diverse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think it's complicated, but I think something that we can definitely attest to is that as we are socialized in the world that we grow up in, certain populations are afforded more access to certain opportunities than other. I think that the different oppression that's faced by women, in the education system, in the workplace, by people of color, by people with disabilities, as you know, the list that you mentioned is similar. There is not equal access to opportunity, and there are a lot of barriers that these folks face on a really institutional level. It's not like there are people being turned away at the door. I think that's pretty evident, and I think that what we need to do is we need to focus tangibly on a few things. So I think in terms of representation, quotas, obviously they do some good, but they're not ideal. We talk about the tokenization of certain populations and how that's not necessarily the most effective way to go about filling those seats. But we certainly can do something in terms of appointments to different places within government offices, both in Canada and the U.S. So I think more dialogue surrounding how we can make these opportunities more accessible to those populations is important. But that, once again, is a long process, and it involves education and it involves outreach. Something that I think can be done quite tangibly is something that's within the hands of folks like yourself, people who are in positions of power, and what they can do to help this move forward. And I think that's essentially by starting the dialogue. I think we all observe it in the media. Whenever politicians stick their neck out to say, this is an issue, we're hearing the calls, and we're going to prioritize this, the media is buzzing, people are doing more research, community groups are taking action, and I think that's the kind of conversation that we can really stimulate to target these issues.
Thanks, Kareem.
So to add to that, I think that one of the important things to talk about, especially when you're looking at groups that are not just women, but gay, transgender, there's an Employment Non-Discrimination Act in front of Congress right now that was recently passed by the Senate, and it's been floating around for about 20 years at this point, which would prohibit employers to make hiring decisions or provide unequal job benefits based on orientation or gender identity, which I'm sure you are familiar with. I think that this is extremely important. Unequal pay is a real problem, and it's not just because people make different life decisions. not everyone has the choices that are involved with making those decisions. So a lot of women opt out of professional careers early, for personal reasons, but many also are forced out for reasons because they can't find flexible enough work, or they can't find flexible enough work that offers salaries that allow them to support their families. This is something that disproportionately affects women of color, transgender women, transgender men, gay families. There's a 15%, so 50% of the transgender community actually earns less than $10,000 a year. And I think that, the government has a lot that it can do in terms of what Kareem said, in the way that you discuss these issues, in the support that you show through passing things like the ENDA, and then also in federal paid family leave. I think that passing, programs like this can offer a huge difference for those communities.
I know the president's deeply passionate about this. I know the prime minister is as well. This is generational challenges that are taking place, but the promotion of women to senior levels of cabinet, Supreme Court for us, it's just been a priority for President Obama. But I relay a story which has been told over and over again about the prime minister and his team talking to then Chrystia Freeland and convincing her to run for office. I think it's going to take senior leaders to take, the word leader means something, and it's going to take leaders like the prime minister around the globe, hopefully, going forward in the United States, to convince people who are unlikely suspects to raise their hand and to give of themselves. And I think that, it's going to take work. But we've made some progress, but not nearly enough. Refugees. Why don't we touch on that? It's a hard issue globally. Less hard here, I think, in some respects, but love your perspective on that. And immigration, refugees, conceptually, what are you guys thinking about that?
Okay, so Steve and Marta are going to try and tackle that.
So I'll begin my answer with answering your recurring question of how we doing, which is awful and apathetically, criminally negligent towards people that are trying to escape an armed conflict in the Middle East, to put it lightly. The situation that's going on is much, much different than the one that happened during World War II, and I don't like it when people try to make comparisons to it, because what was happening during World War II is that you had people who were part of an extremely similar culture emigrating and escaping to the United States and to Canada, and so it was easy for them to assimilate and to just be part of the culture and for there not to be any issues. But that's not the case that we're seeing right now. For example, the New York Times was doing an expose on a lot of Syrian immigrants that had managed to make their way to Germany. And there was a man named Yasser who was explaining that he found life in Germany awful because the only way that he could afford to keep the house and the car and pay the taxes that he had was to allow his wife to take an actual job with a firm, and that if they were living in Syria, he would never allow for that to happen, and that if the war ended tomorrow, he would go back as soon as he could. That is the point of contention that we have that's going on with immigrants now coming in from Syria. But that shouldn't stop us from doing anything. And the fact that a country like Lebanon is taking in 100 times more refugees than the United States is embarrassing to me as an American sometimes, because it feels like not only are we not doing anything, but we're recognizing the problem and we don't care enough to do anything about it. I understand that there's going to be issues, and I understand that the main contention for especially lawmakers in Congress is that there's a lot of security issues and we don't have the time to vet all of the refugees. But for example, my governor, the governor of New Hampshire, came out and said that she was not going to allow any refugees to come into New Hampshire, and she was the only Democratic governor to do so. and it upset a lot of different people. And the main reasons are that not a single refugee that's come to the U.S. since the passing of the 1980 Refugee Act has ever once committed terrorism. The Paris attackers, the Boston bombers, none of them have committed terrorism. And 100% of the terrorist attacks that have happened in the United States in the last 35 years were never once committed by a refugee. And right now, what we are is on the wrong side of a humanitarian issue, and our children are going to be asking us, how could you think like that at the time? How could you not let those people into your country? How could you let children, wash up on the shore dead and be featured in newspapers all over the country? So if I had to give it a grade, I would give it an F. And if they were going to McGill, it would be far worse than a 55%.
Okay. Well, let me just say that I agree with Stephen in that there is a lot left to be done. I think we have made headlines, and for good reason, for accepting, I think, 26,000 Syrian refugees to date. And there are a lot of great reasons to accept refugees, more than just the moral reason. There are a lot of great security reasons to accept refugees. For one, refugee camps are hotbeds for recruitment by extremist groups. Groups like ISIS actually make millions of dollars off of taxation and extortion of the people in their territories. So the more people we bring in, the less people they have to tax. And furthermore, not accepting refugees is what ISIS wants, because it makes potential recruits feel like the West is Islamophobic. In terms of concrete things that we can do here in Canada, I think there are two main things that we can do. The first is eliminate red tape. We've been doing really great in terms of processing times, but I think we can do a lot better. There was a special program in Canada in 1979, 1980, when we were accepting tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, where the processing time was expedited because you had CSIS officers going into the field and conducting interviews there. So establishing some sort of program to eliminate this red tape temporarily would do a lot of good in terms of bringing in refugees a little faster. And second, and one area that I do think Canada is very lacking is our resettlement program. Once we bring in, I think there's like a 40% unemployment rate for refugees right now. A lot of them only are supported for 2 to 3 months and then have to resort to food banks and civil society groups to help them out. So I think one way to deal with that is to facilitate more partnerships between these civil society groups, the ones that are really dealing with these refugees in the grassroots, and the government.
Are any of you volunteering at a refugee resettlement center, food bank, clothing drive, doing anything for refugees? So this is complicated. Our two countries are lands of immigrants. We are, I don't care whoever's in this room, except for First Nations, everybody else came from somewhere else. And many of the people who came to North America came under incredibly difficult sets of circumstances and forced to leave wherever they're from. My family and Vicky's family came to the United States and Canada 100 years ago, fleeing Russian Cossack persecution and religious and economic. And if it were not for Canada and the U.S. at those times, we wouldn't be here today. I think we tend to forget where we've come from and what our sense of obligation is. And the immigration's made us so rich. On the other hand, there are more than 60 million refugees in the world, 60 million. And the question is, neither the United States nor Canada can take in enough people to make as big a dent into 60 million. And so we have to do two things. We have to be humanitarian in our efforts. Immigration's, by the way, good for our societies. Creates diversity, and I think it strengthens us and makes us only better. But at the same time, we have to figure out what's causing this refugee problem in various parts of the world and try to deal with the problem at the source. So those people don't feel so compelled that they have to leave their home and sacrifice all of their belongings, and in many cases, sacrifice lives to just flee those conditions. And so that's what we're trying to do. We, the United States and Canada, are trying in this particular case, and we're talking, I'm assuming, a bit of Syrian refugees, albeit the United States is taking in 85,000 refugees this year, took in 70 last year, going to take in more next year. We'll take 250,000 refugees over 3 years. But not all Syrian refugees. There are refugees around the world. And, you know, we will do that as well, at least 10,000, at least. But we take in a large number of other refugees, too. And that's a subcomponent of our immigration that is taking place. But again, we have to figure out how to raise the economic standards in the world, reduce threats of violence in war-torn areas. We have to make it so that people can be successful in the countries that they're in. How are we doing time-wise?
No, we're doing great. So I think we've now conducted our kind of reverse interview portion of tonight.
I'm done? I have like 100 other questions.
Guess you have to come again next year. So now we're going to be asking the ambassador questions submitted by McGill students, which they were interested in. So this question comes from Sarah, who's an international management student. And she asks, in what ways have your careers in business/finance and in politics been similar, and in what ways have they differed?
So, to be successful in business, I think you need to step back, in my view, and understand who your client is, and understand your client's needs. And the most successful sit down and try to work and fill client needs. And then you can sit down and develop your enterprise back in the good business school strategy of develop a mission and a vision and set goals, strategies, tactics, outcomes. Drive it through, etc. But if you don't understand your client, you don't understand what your client wants and needs, you're going to have a really difficult being successful in the business world. Albeit there's some people that say, you know, I have blue suits and all I sell are blue suits, and you say I'm coming in to buy a gray suit, they can sit down and say, well, no, you should consider blue. I've got blue suits for you, as opposed to trying to fill that client need. And I worked hard my whole life in terms of business, trying to understand clients' needs and trying to fulfill those client needs with products and services. So who's the client in the government role? And I think the client's the citizen. The needs of the citizens are very diverse. If I'm here as the U.S. ambassador, I represent 320 million people in the United States. The needs of 320 million people in the United States run the full gamut. And those that need A, you know, there are other people that say, I don't want A at all. And so you have a very different mindset when you're in government. You have to set your own goals and ideals and philosophies, and people then vote for you or against you and support you with those ideals and say, aha, you represent what I think that I'd like to have for my country or my institution. And for me, I very much know that the president was elected and he had a set of visions and goals, and they were working hard to try to implement those visions and goals for the president. That's, you know, in some ways a little different. Also, when we're sitting there, if we woke up every day and said, how many people really want cars that have higher mileage standards? I'm not sure everybody would have jumped at that. On the other hand, the government was very involved in the restructuring of the auto industry to set 54-mile gallon standards by 2025, that is now increased the mileage standards of the fleet, which has reduced our consumption, or at least the growth rate in consumption of fossil fuels, which is reducing, our footprint. But I think the government set those goals out and tries to implement that. One other thing, the Foreign Service. I had no real direct experience with people in the Foreign Service in my professional life. They're amazing. They give of themselves. They're the smartest people. They give of themselves wholly. They pick up and move every 2 or 3 years to a different country at a different part of the world, in some cases, places of high risk, to represent their country. And that's just an incredible thing. The reality for me, though, when I landed in the embassy, and I had all these amazing people, I sat down with my first team meeting, and I said, wow, this is great. This is my team. Let's go. And all of a sudden, 1/3 of the people there said to me, we're leaving in 60 days. And I said, what do you mean you're leaving? You're great. I mean, can you stay? No, I can't stay. I have to go. And then the summer later, 1/3 left again. And now this summer, 1/3. So now I'm at the point now, where it's my third time, in a very short order, there's not a single person from the Career Foreign Service that will have existed at the embassy when I arrived. And that is a very unusual thing, because in business, if I had a management team, I would do anything to keep my great management team. Persuade them, don't go to a competitor, don't move to another office, keep your management team in place. For me, my entire management team rolls over 1/3 every year, and then in 3 years is entirely replaced, which is a huge difference from the private sector.
Okay, Ronnie asks, from a political science student, asks, with your experience as ambassador, what do you think is the biggest difference and biggest resemblance between Canada and the United States?
Well, there are differences. While the Peace Arch, which exists in the border between Washington State and BC, and it was built 100 years. They call it the Peace Arch because it was 100 years after peace of the War of 1812. And it says basically, children from a common mother. That's what we are. But I don't know if you have siblings. I do. They're not exactly like me. They have different tastes, sometimes different values, sometimes different political beliefs, sometimes different approaches. We're like cousins from the same family, from very similar beginnings, but with different perspectives, and we see things just slightly differently. But that's fine. That's great. I still haven't gotten used to gravy on my French fries, but I'm a ketchup naturalist myself. But we have more similar than not, especially when you look around the world. I will say we all want, I think, have a value set. We want to have a world in a better place for our children and our grandchildren and future generations. I do believe we want to have success and work-life balance. I think that we want to have good health and prosperity, and we want to have peace. The U.S. has a different role. And when you're the largest economic power in the world and you have the largest military in the world, you just have a different role and sets of responsibilities that come with that. And, with that, becomes it's a heavy weight for the United States. And by the way, when you go implement that, inevitably there's some people that are going to say that you're not doing a good job with that. But we're trying the best we can given what we've been given.
All right. So our final question before we wrap things up is from Alfie, who's a political science student. Is, with your experience, do you think that the world's current international system is more or less stable than it was 30 years ago?
30 years ago takes you 1986. 1986. Berlin Wall came down in 89. We lived in a world, yes, it's coming back to me now. I'm a little old here, but mid-1980s, let's see. I'm trying to, 30 years ago. Ronald Reagan was president. A lot of tension between the US and Russia. A lot of tension. Global tension. Wall separating Europe, Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I think it was a very dangerous time. I think it was a very complicated time. I actually think the world's in a better place today. Albeit what I think has changed is we have instantaneous news. And instantaneous news has its positive and negative effects. I'm not against it, it just is what it is. But that news could be sensationalized very quickly without, any sense of whether it's verified or not. Standards are very different because everybody in this room can immediately start broadcasting by just on Twitter or Facebook. By the way, I am on Twitter and Facebook if you want to follow me. I'm trying to enhance my followers. But in all seriousness, I think that it gives the perception of a lot of things going on that would create a fair bit of anxiety for people. I think those things were always going on and things were happening around the world. It's just, first of all, you didn't know about it till the morning paper. If you didn't read the morning paper or watch the evening news and one of the icons on the evening news, either here or in the States, then you missed it and you might have heard about it. But it gave a little space and time to verify, to desensationalize some things, to take the temperature down a little bit, or appropriately ratchet it up when it was more challenging. I'm more optimistic. I think the world's in a pretty good place right this minute. It's not without the work we have to do, but I give a lot of credit to the president. I think we have a nuclear agreement with Iran. We've opened Cuba up. We're sitting here having 200 nations come together on environmental policy. 200 leaders got together on anything, but no less help saving the planet environmentally. I feel good about the multilateral efforts that are taking place. So I'm pretty optimistic about where we are.
So firstly, I'd like to give the warmest welcome to Ambassador Heyman for attending.
Thank you. Wait a minute. I have a bag. Oh, I have a little something. I give these out from the embassy. Some people like them a lot. Some people don't, but it's a good memento for today. So these are hockey pucks with the U.S. Ottawa emblem on it, the Embassy of the United States of America. These are Canadian hockey pucks, by the way. They say Canada on the side. So a little memento. Thanks for participating here.
Thank you, Ambassador Heyman. Thank you. I would also like to give the warmest of thank yous to the consulate staff, Consul General Nina Maria Feit, Principal Suzanne Fortier, and all of the McGill admin, and obviously our lovely panelists for helping us conduct this event. Thank you very much. So, we would like to recommend everyone to be in our reception, which will be happening in room 302, where we'll be serving complimentary wine on SMU. Yeah. And it will allow the students to be to talk to consulate staff members and learn more about what it takes to be a diplomat. And the Ambassador Heyman, if he has time, he can definitely join us for a glass of wine if he's.
And then I'll go to that, what's that, sleep room down in the nap room
Yeah,
downstairs?
exactly.
As I walked by, people were all
Yeah.
kind of relaxed. I said, what is that?
We got new
That's where we
beanbags,
take a nap?
so yeah.
Okay, good.
So-
Now to join you.
Fantastic.
Okay,
So yeah,
thanks.
please join us in room 302 for some complimentary wine and the ambassador and the consul staff. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.